This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. As we've detailed in previous videos, for the last year or so, Turkey has been suffering from dangerously high inflation, largely caused by President Erdogan's unorthodox views on monetary policy. Now, that was bad before, but as the war in Ukraine and the accompanying supply chain disruption has pushed up prices around the world, Turkey's inflation has continued to rise, and the lira has continued to precipitously drop against the dollar. Nonetheless, much to nearly everyone's surprise, the Turkish economy is somehow functioning pretty well at the moment. Real GDP grew by 11% last year, and the OECD's latest forecast predicts a GDP growth of 3% in 2023, one of the highest in the developed world. So in this video, we're going to be looking at why Turkey's inflation rate shows no sign of slowing down anytime soon, how Turkey's economy has somehow performed well despite this, and what it might tell us about inflation more generally. So, before we get into Turkey's new impressive growth forecasts, let's have a quick recap on their inflationary struggles. Now, the story properly gets going in late 2018, when, thanks to a combination of factors, including Trump's steel and aluminium tariffs, censorship of financial data, and Erdogan's interference with the central bank, the lira fell significantly in value. And because Turkey runs a current account deficit, i.e. relies heavily on imports, inflation almost immediately spiked to about 20%. Now, to be honest, it's a fair bit more complicated than that, but this is just a primer for the rest of the video, so if you want to know more, then go and watch one of our previous videos on the topic. Anyway, as you probably know by now, orthodox economic theory will advise raising interest rates in order to counter inflation. But raising interest rates certainly isn't fun, because limiting access to cheap credit can slow economic growth and even cause recessions, but it will cool down domestic demand and protect the rest of your currency. However, unfortunately for, well, the whole Turkish economy, Erdogan doesn't agree with this orthodox economic theory, so he refused to raise rates in order to tamp down inflation, and even sacked any central banker that disagreed with him on this. So, as you'd expect, the lira continued to depreciate, and inflation, well, that continued to rise. Now, things really picked up late last year after Erdogan invoked his Muslim faith in order to justify his policy, which didn't go down too well with investors around the world. And by January, the lira was trading at about 14 to the dollar, and year-on-year inflation was running at about 50%, according to official figures. Electricity prices, which are set by the national regulator, were raised by as much as 125% for high-demand commercial users, and by about 50% for lower-demand households. And natural gas prices jumped too, 50% for industrial use and 25% for residential. Now, Erdogan has tried a whole load of harebrained schemes in order to defend the lira without being forced to raise interest rates, including a very expensive policy involving topping up lira-denominated accounts and trying to convince Turkish citizens to hand over their gold. But ultimately, none of these strategies have really worked. And to be honest, the war in Ukraine hasn't helped the matter either, with the latest data from June putting year-on-year inflation at a ridiculous 78.6%. The lira has also continued its precipitous slide, falling to an all-time low of nearly 18 lira per dollar. For context, in 2017, it was about 3 lira per dollar, and in 2007, it was nearly a 1-to-1. Which means that the lira has lost nearly 90% of its value in the last 15 years alone. Now, given all of this, you'd expect the Turkish economy to be in free fall at the moment. However, so far at least, this hasn't happened, and Turkish growth has actually been astonishingly strong. According to OECD data, Turkey's economy grew by a remarkable 11% in 2021, the highest of any G20 member by some distance. Now, you might assume that this massive growth spike was just a post-COVID bounce, in the same way that the UK bounced back from a 9.4% recession in 2020, with 6.5% growth in 2021. However, Turkey's economy actually grew by 1.8% in 2020, making it one of just 2 OECD countries, alongside China, to record positive growth in that year. Which means that this 2021 data isn't just a massive bounce back from a previously deflated value. Turkey also achieved all of this without borrowing too much from international markets, which is why Turkey's public debt to GDP ratio is just 40%, well below most of its emerging market peers, and even most developed European nations post-COVID. And the OECD expects Turkey's growth to continue into the future as well, with the latest data forecasting growth of 3.7% in 2022 and a further 3% in 2023. Now, if correct, this would give Turkey one of the highest growth rates in the G20, behind just Saudi Arabia, India, Indonesia, and China. And as such, it would also be the highest in Europe. So, how has all of this happened? How has Turkey's economy continued to thrive despite rampant inflation and a collapsing economy? Well, the main thing seems to be the continued strength of consumer spending. Usually, when inflation kicks up, people start spending less money because, well, they just don't have enough money to spend in the first place, which in turn reduces consumption, one of the 4 major components of GDP, and thereby also reducing growth. And that's exactly what's happened across the Western world, where inflation rates of between 5 and 10% have crippled consumer demand. However, despite an official inflation rate of 80% and an unofficial rate possibly twice that, Turkish consumers are apparently undeterred and have continued to spend their money pretty freely. Now, to be completely honest, no one's quite sure why this is. It might be something to do with the fact that a fairly high proportion of Turks have their wealth tied up in foreign assets, which means that life has actually become cheaper for them. Or it might be that Turks concerned about the future of their currency are now spending their lira to buy durable goods, like cars and white goods, preferring to buy stuff right now than just keep holding on to their ever-depreciating lira. Ultimately, no one knows why consumer confidence is still so high, but it does provide an interesting counterpoint to the Western economic orthodoxy, which sees inflation as the foremost economic evil and high interest rates as the only remedy. While it's important not to downplay the suffering experienced by some Turks as the result of inflation, Turkey's economy has nonetheless apparently fared pretty well in a high inflation environment, and there's little evidence of the much feared wage price spiral, which is what Western policymakers spend so much time fretting about. By the way, the wage price spiral refers to the phenomenon whereby wages rise in order to meet prices, pushing prices even higher and therefore creating a positive feedback loop, which ends in hyperinflation and economic collapse. And so far, that hasn't happened in Turkey, and the Turkish government has in fact had to raise minimum wage to encourage wages to keep track with inflation. Now, this is just a single data point, so it's hard to infer too much from it, but it does suggest that the wage price spiral might not be as inevitable as some policymakers assume. And in an era where labour has limited bargaining power, prices do seem to be able to go up without wages following suit. And as such, what's happening in Turkey does suggest that interest rate raises and the economic misery that accompanies them might be unnecessary. Again, this is a single data point, so take everything with an enormous pinch of salt, but it is nonetheless interesting. Anyway, if you want to learn more about the theorized economic impacts of the war in Ukraine, how the wars helped Ukraine forge new official alliances, and even how, despite increasing nuclear rhetoric at the moment, one country was able to give up their nukes voluntarily, then I've got some videos to recommend. That's because we have videos on all of those topics exclusively available on Nebula, which means they will never come to YouTube. So if you want to watch those videos, or any of our other exclusive ones, as well as getting early access to our videos, like this one, which was released on Nebula 24 hours before YouTube, and all of our content ad-free, then Nebula's the place to be. Ultimately, the question is, how much would you pay for all of that? Well, how about £1 a month? No, really. So if you sign up to their superb service, where you'll find tons of high-quality documentaries, then you'll also get Nebula, our streaming service, totally free. That means if you're signing up using our link, you'll get both services for about £1 a month. A crazy good deal. So get yourself loads more TLDR at a super low price and support the channel by clicking the link below. Thanks.